I expected that this process is going to be difficult because we're asking for $10 million. But even though I wasn't talking about it explicitly anymore, how many investors we were talking to and who we were talking to, they sort of knew that because it's such a small community that they all either talk to each other or they see this from proxies. They see that this is sort of like a moving train. And the biggest de-risk that you can possibly provide an investor is that you're going to finish the fundraise with or without them.
Welcome to How to Raise a Round, Carta's podcast about one of the most challenging elements of every startup founder's journey, raising money. Each episode, we sit down with new and veteran founders to hear the stories behind their funding rounds and learn about the challenges, advice, and unexpected lessons they learned along the way. I'm Josh Durst-Wiseman, manager of branded content at Carta and host of How to Raise a Round. Our guest this week is Filip Victor, founder and CEO of the identity verification startup, Madi. In September 2020, Madi closed their very first priced round, a $13.5 million Series A, which, like many of the guests we'll meet this season, Filip raised during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. As an immigrant, a first-time founder, and a young face in the industry, Filip faced additional challenges that complicated his fundraising journey. He had virtually no investor connections, meaning that he was starting from the bottom. And despite the inevitably complicated process of raising his Series A, Filip knew that persisting was the only way to make his goal of accessible identity verification a reality. Coming off a difficult seed round just a few months earlier, this time Filip was determined to do things differently. Today, he tells us how he used the mistakes and hard lessons learned in his seed round to turn his Series A into an efficient, well-oiled process that he could run from a place of confidence and control.
The single overarching reason why the process was in our favor was because we wanted to control as many variables that we could.
Filip had firsthand experience with the difficulties of getting your identity verified when you don't have all your paperwork available.
I was born in Poland, but I came to the US for undergrad and I stayed here, and so I've been here about 11 years. When you're an immigrant, you don't have access to a lot of services. Banking is hard. You really can't access credit history whatsoever. You don't have access to lending products. You can't rent cars at the airport. You struggle renting apartments. Our mission is really to digitize all reputation, starting with basic legal reputation and moving into financial and social reputation as well.
The year was 2019, and Filip had just finished raising a small seed round of $2 million. But despite having a mission he cared about and some seed funding in the bank, Filip quickly found himself in a position that was equal parts exciting and terrifying.
So fortunately, we were at a stage in our business where, separate from the funds that we raised, we were also just accelerating as far as customer acquisition went. And our product was hitting the product market fit that we wanted to see. And we really went from our initial 1 or 2 countries where we were present to the majority of Latin America, which was our early region of interest.
Word of mouth was building, and Madi was suddenly expanding rapidly around the entire globe, which was great except for one big problem. With nothing but their seed money in the bank, Filip was already running out of the critical cash he needed to not just sustain, but accelerate Madi's growth.
So this is 2019. We have just raised a seed round from Sparrow Ventures, and we're growing at this point, and we've raised a pretty small seed round, and we don't have a lot of money. So the second we finish the seed round, we're thinking, what's the next round?
With pressure mounting, he and his team knew they'd have to fundraise again almost immediately after their seed round was over. Working closely with his COO Meghna and the rest of his team, Filip got to work on assessing Madi's goals.
We knew that we were going to need a lot of money. And because we raised a little under $2 million at the time, so we had pretty aggressive goals to hit and not a lot of cash. So we knew that that Series A is going to have to come within 12 months.
Filip went to the drawing board. To pull off a Series A on such a tight turnaround, the team first had to consider the hard metrics that they needed to show in order to prove themselves worthy of Series A money from the VC community.
There are obvious things like lagging indicators like revenue, but we wanted to evidence a lot more things so that we can unlock that capital sooner rather than later. And so we came up with what we called SaaS scorecard, SaaS metrics that we wanted to hit. If you just focus on one, you're missing out on a lot of the resolution because the lagging indicators often take too long to acquire. Even within B2B, Different companies need to hit different metrics. And if you listen to good investors, they look for what type of metrics you're focusing on. Oftentimes, investors call it by vanity metrics.
Now, Filip brings up a really wise point here with vanity metrics. Essentially, he knew from the beginning that there were two types of metrics investors would focus on when he went out on the fundraising trail. The first was vanity metrics, things like page views, registered users, and top-of-funnel downloads. And while these metrics can help to tell a story on the surface, they don't necessarily give founders the clearest picture on what they really need to know: whether or not this company is actually ready to raise funds. Investors who cared too much about vanity metrics would immediately raise a red flag for Filip.
We were growing in an opaque space that most investors did not understand, and then we chose developing regions to be the region of interest for us. So for that reason, I want to think that we had a higher threshold to meet to evidence that we are a legitimate company. So we took that very seriously.
Now, there are certain metrics that companies widely use with investors to prove they're ready to start raising a priced round. Generally, consensus is that you want to get to around $2 million in ARR, or annual recurring revenue, before raising Series A funds. But for Filip, ARR wasn't enough. He asked his team to go deeper and drill down on more meaningful metrics like customer acquisition cost, margin, net retention, and payback ratio. These tangible metrics would help him create an attractive story for the Series A investors to come on board so quickly after the seed.
What I really wanted to show is that this is, on a unit economics basis, profitable business, and it's very scalable. High margins, the cost of acquisition is not as high as they think, and it's decreasing. The payback ratio is improving, and it not only is within the range of American companies, but it can actually be better. We were very conservative in our overall models of what the cost of acquisition needs to be and where the margins can be and how we forecast those. And of course, the account growth as well, like the net retentions, as well as the overall number of customers. So all of those things put together, we wanted to evidence that as a sort of like a little scorecard, and we showed that.
And with metrics now in place in a fast-growing business, all systems were go. Until, that is, Filip started to hear thunder in the distance and noticed that there were dark clouds forming on the horizon.
Around the time when we were raising, there was one or two companies that raised a significant amount of money who were around our size. Separate to that, there were also bigger companies broadly in our space that were raising significant amounts of capital, like Series C type of thing.
Competitors raising funds before you do can be a death sentence for your fundraise. In Filip's case, these competitors weren't just entering the market alongside him, they were announcing huge funding rounds before he even had a chance to get out the gate.
I learned a hard lesson that there are different grades of investors, and there are people who overestimate the market's capacity to absorb supply. How many companies can there be in a market? And a lot of investors, especially the ones who don't totally understand your space, they will assume that it's a winner-take-all market and that you're not going to survive. They consider that often as a huge risk that needs to be taken into account, and oftentimes walk away just from even trying to learn what the space looks like because they don't want to enter a space that is already competitive.
Filip charged forward, but privately, he was feeling the pressure.
The thing that really was bothering me most was that this specific space is something that I came to appreciate and be interested in so much that if I fail, I was not at all worried about myself. What I was really worried about is that I didn't think that people would trust me in going into this space again. And so I felt that even though I could probably start another company, I was not going to be able to participate in this marketplace. And that really bothered me so much that I really was basically determined to go into poverty over staying in the market. When I sometimes hear investors talk about what it takes to start a company nowadays, I think the one thing that they miss is that just because there's a lot of blogs, that all of a sudden that somehow makes the company formation much easier. This information is valuable, but it's also very dry. So it's a little bit like trying to read a book and learn how to code. You just kind of have to do it. And a lot of the information is really hard to convey in words. So I understood exactly how to raise money on a theoretical level because I had a lot of friends in VC, and I actually spent a month working in venture capital as well in college. So I understood it on like this dry level, but I didn't understand what it takes to really get a term sheet.
As he prepared to set out for his Series A, Filip was determined to not repeat the mistakes he made in his seed round only a few months earlier. Filip's goal was to find the controllable elements of his fundraise and create a process that removed luck from the equation entirely. With this key understanding, Filip sat down with his team. They ran through the metrics, they pored over the numbers, and with the sun setting over their little office in San Francisco, it was time for Madi to raise the round.
We wanted to control as many variables of this process that we could and wanted to basically leave the fewest things to chance. There's always going to be some extreme things that could happen at the seed round and before. Fundamentally, what I didn't understand was the conversion ratio. So I was wondering, how do we make sure that we get a lot more introductions, and what do we need to do to reverse engineer 2 or 3 term sheets?
2 or 3 term sheets. That's all Filip needed from major VCs to raise the bulk of the $13 million he was after. With several term sheets in hand, Filip could ensure that he was getting the best deal possible by comparing and contrasting different scenarios. This sounds pretty simple, but Filip soon learned it was anything but.
From that goal, how do we look at the numbers? And we first took it upon ourselves to understand, what does the industry standard look like as far as conversions go? And we did a lot of study and talking to a lot of different VCs in the Bay Area. And we understood, of course, that the conversions look different on different stages of the company. But to my surprise, I realized that seed to Series A is around 5%.
You heard that number right. Between seed and Series A, the average conversion ratio from warm introduction to term sheet is less than 5%. That meant if Filip wanted 2 term sheets, he needed warm introductions to at least 40 qualified investors. And if he needed warm intros to 40, that meant he'd have to do outreach to at least 3 times that many people.
As a founder, especially of a seed stage company, the one thing that you very quickly start seeing is that there's 3 different types of investors that you're going to be meeting. The first is the person who actually owns the money. The second most common breed is a principal, so non-partner person in the fund. And the third is obviously the partner of that institutional fund. But the latter two, you have to understand that they manage other people's money. And so the way they view risk is very different from the first type of person who actually has the money and they're investing on their own behalf.
This was a key learning that would help Filip tailor his pitch depending on the kind of investor he spoke to. People investing their own money, like angel investors, will view the risk of an investment differently than those who are managing other people's money, like VCs.
So just like in a sales process, when you have marketing qualified leads and sales qualified leads, how you define what a qualified is of course going to determine what the conversion is. But we were very conservative and decided that from our initial list of the investors that we were interested in potentially partnering with us, that is essentially an unqualified list. The other fundamental thing that I learned through how sloppy this whole process had been and how I ran it, I realized that the longer I spent time talking to some investors who were sort of interested, but not very, I was actually shooting myself in the foot by making ourselves look desperate to other investors because I just did not understand how they appraise different companies. I thought that they looked at only the fundamentals, how we're growing and the revenue. But the truth is that there is so many deals that these investors could deploy capital into that they, beyond the simple fundamentals, which are very thin file, like you have maybe 6 months of metrics or something, they have to rely on something else. And so they end up relying on their social network and what other people think about the company and so on. This was something that I completely did not have a handle on.
This was going to be tough, and the one luxury Filip didn't have was time. What he did have, though, was a plan. To control the narrative and stay in the driver's seat, he'd use a process called cohorting to batch each part of the fundraising process into one of 4 distinct phases.
Through that process of trying to control the timeline, we basically chunked it into a few phases, and we realized that there's essentially 4 phases to this entire process. The initiation phase, and then outbound phase, pitch phase, and closing phase.
Phase 1 was called initiation, and it took a lot longer than Filip initially expected.
In the initiation phase, there's a lot of elements. You need to have a deck before you reach out to an investor. The scorecard that you have, evidencing your financials and so on. All that stuff takes much longer than you imagine. It's not an hour or a day. It sometimes can take a week or 2 to validate that this looks like what it's supposed to look like.
What Filip expected least of all was how difficult it would be to even book the meetings with investors, let alone get to a yes or no from them.
After Meganat joined, when we started preparing for what our Series A would look like, we started thinking about what we need to do to get it done. The first thing that I already knew from my experience was that I need to talk to a lot more people. When founders say, oh, you need to be so tough that you need to hear like 90 or 100 no's, What people don't say is that getting those 100 meetings to begin with is really difficult because most people really don't want to risk their social capital and their reputation in introducing you unless they know that you're crushing it already. The first phase, we imagine that we run our business pretty tight and all of the metrics that we need to show in evidence, we already have. And that the pitch deck itself, this is just a presentation. So how much longer can it really take? And I already had a pretty outdated seed presentation. So we'll just update that. We thought that's going to take a week. We wanted to start the fundraise in June. And consequently, we thought that the outbound phase is going to start in June as well, because we allotted only a week for it. But every day, day by day and week by week, it kept on stretching, and it ended up being a whole month to prepare the deck. The reason why that would be the case is because the deck itself needs to be really clear to understand. Now, this is not going to be the case for every company. We just happen to be in a very complex space that people don't understand. The thing that founders are often told is that their deck has to pass a flip-through test.
Now let's talk about that for a second. What is the flip-through test? It all comes down to understanding your customer, and in this case, Filip understood investors very well. He knew they sit through dozens of presentations all day, every day. They meet with hundreds of companies a month, and when it comes to the pitch deck, most of the time they only have a few seconds to flip through and learn your company's story.
And so how you present what you do and your vision, and how you bridge that with the strategy of your go-to-market is really a tricky problem to do in 10 slides. I think what people underestimate is how difficult it is to compress your story. You can kind of tell that people really do spend like 5 seconds per page. And so it kind of needs to be like a menu at a restaurant. It's a brochure that has to capture people's imagination. And all it's supposed to do is generate leads for your top of funnel and not describe all of your business in its full glory.
6 weeks later, Filip finally had a brand new deck and a tight pitch that was rehearsed and ready for prime time. That meant it was time for the toughest phase yet. Phase 2, outreach. For the outreach phase, Filip allocated 4 weeks.
When you start fundraising, there will be people who get super excited about your story. On the other side of the spectrum, there will be people who will give you super candid feedback and say, this is cool, I'm not interested. The latter side is very rare. It's very rare for an investor to give you such honest feedback. This is highly appreciated, and it's something that investors imagine the founders don't want to hear. As a founder, you want to get to a yes or no as quickly as possible. They kind of want to be helpful, and they want to appear like they have more social capital than they actually do. And so you end up tagging them on your CRM as, okay, this person can introduce me to that person. And then push comes to shove, you realize that that introduction is somehow not coming through. And what you should have known is that you really need to validate it like 3 times over in case that investor doesn't actually know this person.
Filip's goal was 40 warm introductions, and with the clock ticking, he didn't have time to wait for introductions from people who meant well but couldn't actually follow through on connections they'd promised to make. To hold himself and his network accountable, Filip turned investor outreach into a prospecting exercise and created a system that would quantify his networking into a numbers game that he could control.
What we did is we created a huge CRM with all of our connections, all of our investors. We had a lot of angels at this time, and created on top of our entire top of funnel of the funds that we wanted to talk to. We asked everybody in the same CRM, so they all saw each other, to put who they know and how well, and sort of score how well do you know them. It was sort of like this litmus test. Would you be able to introduce us? Would you be able to get me a meeting with this person?
This was a key ingredient. By making the CRM chain public, Filip created social pressure for his network to actually follow through on the introductions they'd promised publicly to make.
It's such a concrete question that you can't say, yes, I know this person, because all of a sudden it turns into a process that they'll be asked to actually introduce you. And in that moment, you realize that people know far fewer people than their LinkedIn will show.
And just like a great sales org, Filip and his team created a regular system of pings and follow-ups to get a yes from every investor they could and suss out the no's quickly so they could move on.
We had to ping investors 3, 5, 6, 10 times to make the introductions that they committed to making. And I have to say that they all want to help and they all have your side, but some of them don't know the people that they claim to know. And you just have to take that into account. And also, most of them are really busy. You can't expect them to shoot 40 or 30 introductions or something unless you make it super easy. So you want to basically do everything you can to lubricate that process for them. So that's basically what we did. And interestingly, we found that there's a few people in our cap table who were like these super nodes who just connected us to a ton of people and actually connected us to the people that they knew and that they knew them well.
By staying in the driver's seat and controlling the entire outreach process, in a matter of just 2 weeks, Filip managed to schedule more than 70 warm introductions to investors all over the country. But here's the thing that really separated Madi's fundraise and put it over the top. When investors tried to schedule meetings outside of Filip's predefined dates for doing pitches, he actually turned them down. The pitch phase was set for the following month, and he was committed to having all those conversations happen in one single cohort. What he didn't realize at the time was that by staying in control and refusing to deviate from the plan, he was creating a sense of scarcity, urgency, and exclusivity in the market. Soon, he wasn't even reaching out to investors. They were reaching out to him.
We started getting a lot of inbound from investors at the beginning of Q2. So phase 1 started in Q3, but we all of a sudden started getting a lot of inbound throughout the whole second quarter, but even at the beginning, 20 to 30 funds reached out roughly around the same time. And there was a lot of people who were introduced to us. So they were already qualified and they were interested and they wanted to be let known when our fundraising stage began.
With the calendar now stacked from morning to night, it was time for the big show. Phase 3, the pitch.
Depending on how well you're doing and how many people you're talking to, your phase 3, when you're pitching people, you will get your first term sheet somewhere in the first 2 weeks, hopefully. Our first term sheet came in, like I said, in the first 3 days. The second term sheet came in a day or two after that.
By keeping himself firmly in the driver's seat, Filip and his team freed themselves up to approach each investor pitch from a place of calm and security, as opposed to their seed round where their fate rested on every new meeting. And this time, when a surprise opportunity came up in the 11th hour, Filip knew he wasn't just getting lucky, because he came to the table with multiple offers in hand and a ton of leverage behind him.
At that point, one of our angels introduced us to a fund called Tribe Capital. It was pretty late in the game, actually. I didn't know too much about them, but we were enjoying the process, if I can call it enjoying. I mean, it was, of course, somewhat anxiety driving. But we were being pursued at that point by a lot of good funds, and some were already offering term sheets. So we knew that we were in a good spot anyway. And we were still within the first 2 weeks of this pitch phase. So I took my first meeting with Arjun, who's the managing partner at Tribe Capital.
Arjun was a managing partner, so Filip knew who he was pitching and exactly what the incentives were.
One day I drove down to Arjun's house to keep talking. My COO was with me, Meghna. We had some dinner with his family, and we barely even talked about the company. We were just sort of chatting about how he sees venture capital and just life. I was driving back from that dinner. I think it must have been 11 p.m. or something. I was driving back to San Francisco, and we were getting very excited about another fund at around that time. But throughout this drive, we realized that we really appreciated how Tribe ran this process. That is to say, very objectively. Because if someone is objective when you're hot as a company, they're going to be objective when you're not. And this showed me that what they're doing is being metrics driven and looking for facts, looking for the signal in the noise, rather than looking to others, what other people think of us. And that gave me that conviction that they're the right partner. And I remember explicitly an exchange with my COO. I said, what are we doing? Let's just get this over with. I want to get back to business.
Having found the right lead for his Series A and with the full monetary target committed, Filip could finally see the finish line. That night, he decided to officially start Phase 4, closing.
I remember coming back to our office and just texting Arjun back. I think it must have been well past midnight, and just saying, okay, man, let's just go over this. So he sends me a term sheet 5 minutes later, and I signed it. The funny thing I remember is that he made a typo, which made us 15% or more at a higher valuation. And I remember him saying well, I'll respect it. Obviously I signed it already. But in goodwill, since this was our partner, we decided, no, let's redraw this. And after this, I was super happy to just be done. And instantly it all clicked that this was absolutely the right partner for us. And from there, it was easy. They made the whole phase 4, which did take a whole month. They made that very simple.
With Tribe Capital officially on Madi's cap table, the rest of the term sheets dominoed right along, and Filip was able to fill out the rest of his fundraise with small strategic investors that provided the right value for his business. In just 3 short months, he and his team had done it. Their Series A was a success.
If you want to hold on to that outcome of coming back to the rest of your company with the money that you were hoping to raise and with the other things that partners and other sort of like unfair advantages that you wanted to gain in the shortest amount of time, that you really can control a lot of input into this process.
By learning from his seed round, Filip turned Madi's Series A into a gold standard for clean, controlled, and quantified fundraising. If there's one thing he learned along the way, it's to go into your fundraise with concrete and measurable outcomes. In total, Madi raised $13.5 million in their Series A. They had a whopping 40 investors participate in the round, with 3 term sheets from major VCs and 37 small strategic investors rounding out the rest.
This is really the major thing that I try to pass down to people is get very concrete about the outcome that you want to gain. Obviously, the amount of money is one thing that people hold on to, but there are other things that you may be implicit about.
Next time on How to Raise a Round.
This is why I started this journey in the first place. And this was something I was and am passionate about, which is empowering others to do something ambitious, do something that makes a difference, and do something which allows us to feel we have purpose.
We sit down with Sean Hathiramani, founder and CEO of FlockJ, to learn how he relied on his company's core values to attract some of the biggest investors in both Silicon Valley and Hollywood for his Series A. This podcast is presented by eShares Incorporated, doing business as Carta, Carta Incorporated, and Carta Ventures. The opinions of the guests and host are their own and do not reflect the view of eShares Incorporated, doing business as Carta, Carta Incorporated, and Carta Ventures. Listeners should not treat any opinions or comments as investment, financial, legal, accounting, or tax advice. The content of the podcast is not legal, financial, or tax advice and is not meant to recommend or offer the purchase or sale of a security. This podcast is informational only. How to Raise a Round is a Hit-Start Media production. The show is written and co-produced by me, Josh Durst-Wiseman. Hit-Start Media founder Theo Miller is creative director. Olivia Laurie is production manager, with sound production by Nick Canepa and script production by Mary Kelleher. This podcast is presented by eShares Inc., doing business as Carta Inc., Carta, and Carta Ventures.